Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the direct route to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner, and to recap, in part one of this lesson, we defined enterprise environmental factors and provided a general overview. We then went through the different EEFs for the first 5 knowledge areas. Here in part 2, we continuing our coverage of the EEFs for the last 5 knowledge areas and conclude with a review. We still have a bit to cover, so let's get started. Our next knowledge area is Project Human Resources Management. It follows a similar pattern to what we saw in cost as well as in quality, which means the first 2 processes, plan human resource management and acquire project team, they have enterprise environmental factors that we need to consider, but develop project team and manage project team, they don't. Let me run through the reasoning again as this relates to Project Human Resources Management, very similar to what I said in Project Quality Management. The first 2 processes, plan human resources management and acquire project team, that's where we plan things. That's when we start up things for our project. There we have to take all these internal and external factors into consideration. But once we have all of that done, when we're ready to move forward to develop the project team and manage the project team, there are usually few or none enterprise environmental factors that we need to take into consideration because we already took them into consideration in the first 2 processes as we created our human resources management plan. So let's do our usual brief overview of what these EEFs are and then jump into a couple of examples that we have selected for you. Plan Human Resources Management. This is the first of our 4 processes. And here we have to take into consideration that we have an organizational culture and structure that will, I promise, influence the way you develop your human resources management plan. Then we have existing human resources, the people who work for us at this time. This is definitely going to influence who is going to be brought onto the project. We have geographical dispersion of the team members, personnel administration policies, market conditions, both internal personnel administration policies telling you what you need to do in regards to human resources on the project, and of course the marketplace conditions. Well, they're going to tell you if you have to bring new people on and whether or not these people are even available. The second process is acquire project team. Here we have to consider existing information on human resources, including availability, competency levels, prior experience, interest in working on the project, their cost rate, and so on. Personnel administration policies are also to be considered, such as those that affect our ability to outsource on the project. The organizational structure is very much going to influence how you're going to acquire a project team. And lastly, co-location or multiple locations are going to influence how you acquire the project team. So the first 2 processes, yes, they had EEFs to consider, and as we've learned, develop project team none, manage project team none, because at the end of the second process we have taken everything we need to take into consideration. It's now part of our plan, and now as we execute the plan, develop project team, manage project team, we do not have to go out and look for other factors that may influence these processes. All right then, how do these personnel administration policies influence both plan human resource management and acquire project team? Well, simple. You will just have a number of policies in your company that define how you deal with your personnel, how you deal with your HR. Of course, most of these policies, they will come directly from your human resources department, but many of these policies may even be influenced by external factors such as the law in your country, the law in your state, where you live in, where you execute the project. So, for example, In your organization, you may have a policy concerning leave. We could also talk about hiring and firing, bringing people onto your project and taking them off again. There can be a policy in regards to overtime. There can be a policy in regards to compensation. All of these personnel administration policies need to be taken into consideration as you develop the human resources management plan and as you assemble your project team. The second one up for discussion is the organizational structure. You may work within a functional, projectized, or matrix organizational structure. The organizational structure defines who has the authority to hire and bring people onto your project. Just imagine, if you are working in a weak matrix organization, that means that you, as a project manager, really don't have much say over your project. You're more of a project coordinator, or you may serve more as a project expediter. Therefore, it's not just you who's going to hire and bring on these resources to the project. That is most likely the functional manager's job to do. However, if on the other hand you are in a projectized organization, then you, so to speak, are the king or the queen of your project. You will be the man or woman who's going to set the hiring strategy and make the hiring decisions for the project. And lastly, location. Yes, the geographical location of your project team is a major factor when it comes to human resources. If your project is out there in the desert, well, some people might not be willing to work in that location. Other questions to consider is, will the team be all in the same location? Will they be in the same time zone even? Or if your project is geographically dispersed in 15 locations throughout the world, are you going to fly all of the candidates from the 15 places to you locally to interview them on your local site so that you can make decisions about hiring these people on your project? Probably not. You're going to have to take this into consideration. You're going to have to work with the people who currently work in those 15 locations to try to understand what kind of people are needed on the project, what kind of cultural differences are there, and trust that these people locally will find the right personnel to hire locally for your particular project. We are moving on to project communications management, and the situation here is the same as we have seen in several previous knowledge areas. In this case here, plan communications management. Yes, there are internal and external factors that you need to take into consideration. But the two others, manage communications and control communications, there are none that you need to take into considerations. So, in plan communications, you take all the communications related factors into consideration. You integrate them into your communications management plan. Once they are in the plan, then you are executing the plan. You don't have to go on about relevant rules and regulations anymore and go out and seek them as you manage and control your communications. No, because these rules and regulations, they're already considered within your project's context, and you have defined them in the communications management plan. There is something very surprising about the EEFs in our first process here, Plan Communications Management, because according to the PMBOK guide, we have to take every single enterprise environmental factor that may exist into consideration. So 100%, everything that influences our project internally and externally has to be used here. Well, the good question now is why? Why on earth would we need all of them in plan communications? Well, let me ask you a simple question. What do you spend most of your time doing as a project manager? Well, according to Harold Kersner, 90% of what we do is communicating. So communication is one of the biggest success factors on any project. Therefore, plan communications management as a process needs to be adapted to all the factors that may influence your project. So it's not surprising that you need to consider every single one of the factors that you could conceivably think of as you plan your communications. But once you have factored all of them into your first process, well, we can pretty much skip the next two, because managed communications and control communications, as we have just learned on the previous slide, no EEFs to consider at all. So because in planned communications management we have to take every single enterprise environmental factor into consideration, as an example here we selected one that is most likely going to be on every project that you manage. And that is the organizational culture as well as the structure. Of course, this will influence your project in regards to the type of communication that you have. We can see how an organization who practices very open communication would be very different from an organization who has a very secretive and restrictive communications policy. Your company culture or structure may be that you as the project manager are not allowed to communicate directly with the employees. This has to go through, let's say, the department heads or the heads of communication. Therefore, you have to bring these people into the mix as well. And of course, there's also the question of the availability of communications technology that you have within your organization, within your company, and that's going to influence how you communicate as well. Here you see the 6 processes of project risk management. Let's identify which ones have EEFs as input. And frankly, the trend that we've seen so far continues, that the first processes of the knowledge area are greatly influenced by our enterprise environmental factors. Both plan risk management and identify risks get a green check mark. Perform qualitative risk analysis has no enterprise environmental factors as input, but perform quantitative risk analysis gets a check mark. Plan risk responses and the last one, control risk, again they get the red X, meaning there is nothing to consider when it comes to the EEFs. And here are the EEFs for these processes. Plan risk management. We need to take into consideration risk attitudes, risk threshold, and the risk tolerances that our stakeholders and our company as a whole have in order to plan our risk management approaches. The second process, identify risks, has a few more, as you can see here. There are published information, academic studies, published checklist, benchmarking, industry studies, and risk attitudes which need to be taken into consideration as we identify the risks, the many risks on our project. One of the quirky things to remember about project risk management is the fact that perform qualitative risk analysis has no enterprise environmental factors that we need to consider, but perform quantitative risk analysis does. There are industry studies of similar projects by risk specialists and risk databases that may be available from industry or proprietary sources that we need to consider as we perform this in-depth review of our risk, called the quantitative risk analysis. And then, of course, in the remaining 2 processes, plan risk responses and control risks, there's nothing at all that needs to concern us in regards to the EEFs as we're going through these processes. Let's jump into the details and look at 3 of these factors here under project risk management. We'll begin with the risk attitudes and tolerances, and then also look at published information and published checklists. So, risk attitudes and tolerances. Of course, these will affect how you manage risk on your project. Here we're talking about the degree of risk that an organization can withstand. Now remember, an organization as such, as an entity, doesn't really have risk attitudes or risk tolerances. It's the people working in the organization that do. So we're really talking here about the risk attitudes and the risk tolerances that the stakeholders on your project will have. They will influence how we plan and then later on also execute risk management on our project. And then our next 2 examples are the published information as well as the published checklists. Very close to each other. They both come from the identify risks process. That's where they exert most of their influence. What happens here is this. all projects have a certain amount of risk. We as project managers have to make sure that we properly manage risks, but it's something that many of us are not really comfortable or too comfortable doing, and that's why there are consultants out there that specialize in the area of project risk management. Published information, guess what? There is a market for their knowledge, which they have documented and put into writing. Absolutely. There are products out there with risk management articles, guidelines, tools, as well as commercial databases that are available to help you in risk identification. And yes, there are also published checklists available that you can use for your specific industry, and these will allow you to go through your processes, go through your project, and help identify possible risks on your project. Let's not forget that these do not necessarily have to be external. Your organization could have such a checklist. You could have a checklist from a previous similar project. You as the project manager can use and adapt it for your project to use it in identifying possible risks. We are moving on to the next knowledge area, which of course is project procurement management. And if you look at the screen, you can already guess that the trend which we have seen continues all the way. Only our first process, plan procurement management, has enterprise environmental factors that we need to take into consideration, because once we've taken them into consideration early on and we created our project procurement management plan, we don't have to do so again when we proceed on to conducting our procurements, controlling our procurements, and then in the end closing our procurements. At that point, we refer back to our procurement management plan and to our overall project management plan. The relevant external and internal enterprise environmental factors are managed and referenced in those documents. The factors that influence plan procurements are not really all too difficult to understand. Here's the overview from the PMBOK guide. We have marketplace conditions, product, service and results available in the marketplace, suppliers, terms and conditions, as well as unique local requirements. We'll take a closer look at 3 of these in just a little bit, but just as a reminder here, conduct procurements as well as administer procurements and close procurements do not have any enterprise environmental factors to consider. So I promised you 3 examples. Here we go, and we begin with the marketplace conditions. And we're talking about procurement here, which means we are going outside of our project to purchase a service or a product. And the question is, well, is what we need even available on the market? Or is this something completely new, maybe a biotechnological application that doesn't even exist yet and needs to be built through a project that we outsource to a particular supplier in the market out there, and that automatically takes us over to the suppliers. Does such a supplier with the needed capability even exist? And are we able to buy it from them? Where are they located? Or in our example, perhaps we are limited to a small handful of laboratories with the biotech capabilities that we require for that particular application. And then we also have the unique local requirements that we have to think about. And the number 1 item here that comes to mind is, of course, the law. There may be local laws that pertain to the contracts that you need to obey to procure your resources. And there may be also local laws in regards to labor conditions, hiring and firing, and so on when it comes to procurement. The project stakeholder management knowledge area consists of 4 distinct processes, and each one of them is in a different process group. Identify stakeholders is performed as part of the initiating process group and has enterprise environmental factors as inputs. Plan stakeholder management is performed as part of the planning process group, and it too has EEFs to consider as inputs. For manage stakeholder engagement, which is performed as part of the executing process group, and finally for control stakeholder engagement, performed as part of the monitoring and controlling process group, we do not have to consider any EEFs as inputs. So let's take a look at the factors that you should be aware of for these two processes and then jump into a couple of examples. The first process, identify stakeholders. Here we take the organizational or the company culture into consideration, any governmental or industry standards that we have to comply with, and any global, regional or local trends, practices or habits. And then the second process is plan stakeholder management. And here it lists organizational culture, structure and political climate as the most important ones to consider, although all factors are used as inputs to this particular process here. And just for completeness sake, the two remaining processes, manage stakeholder engagement and control stakeholder engagement, both have no EEFs that we need to consider. We already touched on industry standards and government standards when we talked about project integration management. Let's examine how these relate to the project stakeholder management knowledge area, particularly to the identify stakeholders process. Basically, if there are standards which have been set and which need to be met by your project, you may then have to engage with different stakeholders related to that standard. What do I mean by this? Well, there will be others who practice or who have experience with this standard. Perhaps other parties within or outside your organization who are involved in creation, governance, review, training, communication, possibly accreditation and policing and ensure adherence to the standard. For example, if your project is requiring you to have patient medical records or information available online, you would need to consider stakeholders who are familiar with the different privacy and data protection standards as they are set by the government, healthcare and computer securities industry. Next, we have trends, practices and habits, and these can be anywhere from global, regional or local environments. You need to consider their relevance to your project. If your scope is very global and a trend, practice or habit is very localized, you may not need to worry yourself about it. You have to understand their persistence or longevity, especially with trends that may be considered en vogue today. Well, they may be out of vogue tomorrow and may not be worth considering for your project. And for the identify stakeholders process, you need to consider whether additional stakeholders are required, such as experts, leaders, or practitioners of that particular trend, practice, or habit. You may want to have a member from the group whom you are targeting for your project. For example, if you're launching a new product for teenagers where you plan to use internet and mobile phones as marketing channels, you cannot ignore the growing trend for this age group towards online social networking. So you enlist experts or those with experience in that subject matter. And finally, we have to consider the aspects of the political climate that are relevant for the project. They could be significant to your organization, region, or the world. There could be strong sentiments for or against a cause, direction, or opinion, which may impact the project. For example, there could be some office politics involved. You could have a situation where you have strong allies who support the project, but on the other hand, you could be in a place where you encounter tremendous negativity at every turn. It may be a constant tug of war with others in the organization as you go through your project. Well, and that was the last knowledge area, the last process, and the last example here in our EEF review. What have we learned from going through this process for all the knowledge areas? Well, we observed how enterprise environmental factors are involved in early processes. EEFs are inputs to all initiating processes and to most, but not all, planning processes. With the exception of the project integration management knowledge area, there is no need to consider enterprise environmental factors for monitoring and controlling processes. Enterprise environmental factors are never inputs to the closing processes. Let's review. Enterprise environmental factors, or EEFs, refer to both internal and external factors over which the project team has little or no control. The enterprise environmental factors, they surround or influence a project's success. These factors may come from any and all enterprises involved in the project. Enterprise environmental factors may enhance or constrain the options that you have as the project manager, and they may have a positive or negative influence on the outcome or the success of your project. EEFs are considered as inputs to early processes. This is true for all initiating and most planning processes. And as we have seen in many knowledge areas, only the first 1 or 2 processes are really affected by these EEFs. There is no need to reconsider them once they are documented in the first 1 or 2 processes. The documents themselves are then what serves as inputs to the executing and monitoring and controlling process of that particular knowledge area. And finally, as we've already seen on the previous slide, enterprise environmental factors are never an input to a process which is in the closing process group. And to close out this lesson, here is a little brain teaser for you, a sample exam question which reads, which of the following is not an enterprise environmental factor? And as possible answers we have A, organizational culture and structure, B, company work authorization systems, C, stakeholder risk tolerances, or D, organizational standard processes and policies. So which of these is not an EEF? The answer is, of course, D, organizational culture and structure, company work authorization systems, and stakeholder risk tolerances are all enterprise environmental factors that we discussed in this lesson. However, organizational standard processes and policies belong to, well, organizational process assets. And with that, we have come to the end of this lesson. So it's time for Justine to say,
I look forward to seeing you again.
and of course I say, until next time.